The morning sun hadn't yet touched the sidewalks of Millbrook when Maria Delgado inserted her key into the lock of Café Luna, just as she had done every day for the past 11 years. The familiar scent of coffee beans and freshly baked conchas filled the air as she flipped through a stack of unopened mail on the counter. Her fingers paused at an official-looking envelope from First Regional Bank. Something about its weight made her stomach tighten. Inside, black letters marched across crisp white paper, each word more devastating than the last. Her hands trembled as she read, "Notice of default and intent to foreclose." The numbers didn't make sense. She had never missed a payment on her business loan. In fact, she had just made an extra principal payment last month to get ahead. Maria's mind raced back to that day 6 months ago when Thomas Webb, the bank's new regional manager, had visited her cafe. His tailored suit and practiced smile seemed out of place among the mismatched chairs and local artwork that made Café Luna feel like home. He had presented what he called a fantastic opportunity, a chance to refinance her existing loan at what he claimed was a better rate. The paperwork had been complex, full of financial terms she wasn't familiar with, but he had assured her it was standard procedure. Now, as she logged into her online banking account, her world began to crumble. The loan payments had nearly tripled. Hidden fees and penalties she had never known about were draining her account dry. The better rate had been a cruel illusion, masking a predatory adjustable rate that had skyrocketed after the first 3 months. The morning regulars would be arriving soon, construction workers stopping for their pre-dawn coffee, teachers grabbing a quick breakfast before class, elderly couples who had been coming since she first opened. They were more than customers, they were family. How could she tell them that their gathering place might disappear? As she mechanically went through the motions of opening the cafe, her phone buzzed. It was Elena from the Mexican grocery store 2 blocks down. "Maria, did you get the letter too?" Elena's voice cracked. "They're saying I owe them thousands more than my original loan. This can't be right." A second call came before she could respond, James from the dry cleaners across the street. Then another from the owner of the Vietnamese restaurant around the corner. One by one, she discovered that nearly every small business owner in the neighborhood who had refinanced with First Regional was facing the same nightmare. The morning rush came and went in a blur. Maria smiled and served, her practiced efficiency masking the storm raging inside. But her regular customers knew her too well. Mrs. Henderson, who had been coming in for her morning tea since the cafe opened, reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. "Something's wrong, dear." "What is it?" Before Maria could answer, the bell above the door chimed. Thomas Webb walked in, his smile as practiced as ever. "Mrs. Delgado, I trust you received our notice? I'm here to discuss your options." His voice carried across the cafe, causing conversations to pause and heads to turn. Maria felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. She thought about her father, who had worked 2 jobs to save enough money to help her start this cafe. She thought about her daughter, who was supposed to inherit this legacy someday. She thought about all the other business owners in the neighborhood facing the same crisis. "My options?" Maria's voice was steady, stronger than she felt. "Like the option you gave me 6 months ago? The one that's destroying businesses all over this neighborhood?" Webb's smile flickered. He hadn't expected resistance. "Now, Mrs. Delgado, you signed the agreement. If you had read the terms more carefully." "In English," interrupted Mrs. Henderson, rising from her seat. "Terms written in complex legal English that you knew many of these business owners wouldn't fully understand." How convenient. The cafe had gone completely silent. Every customer was watching now. Mr. Park, from the dry cleaners next door, had walked in just in time to hear the exchange. He moved to stand beside Maria. Then Elena appeared in the doorway, followed by other business owners who had received the same devastating news that morning. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private," Webb suggested, his composure cracking slightly as he noted the growing crowd. No, Maria replied firmly. No more private discussions. No more hidden terms. Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of everyone. She pulled out her phone and pressed record. In fact, I think it's time everyone heard exactly what First Regional Bank has been doing to our community. Webb retreated, but the damage was done. By noon, social media was buzzing with videos of the confrontation. Local news vans appeared outside the cafe. Maria's phone rang constantly, reporters, other business owners, community activists. A hashtag was trending, #MillbrookFightsBack. That evening, after closing, Maria sat at one of her cafe tables, surrounded by fellow business owners, community leaders, and 2 pro bono lawyers who had reached out after seeing the viral videos. The table was covered with loan documents, each telling the same story of predatory practices carefully disguised as helping hands. They picked our neighborhood for a reason, said James Park, spreading out his own documents. They thought we wouldn't fight back. That we'd be too scared, too isolated, too busy trying to survive to notice what they were doing. Maria looked around the table at the faces of her fellow business owners, immigrants, first-generation Americans, people who had poured their life savings into building something meaningful. They had all believed in the American dream. Now they were living an American nightmare. But something else was happening too. The nightmare was bringing them together. The very community First Regional had tried to exploit was becoming its worst nightmare. As Maria listened to the lawyers outline their options for a class action lawsuit, she realized that Thomas Webb's visit to her cafe that morning hadn't marked the beginning of their defeat, it had sparked the start of their resistance. Her phone buzzed with another message. Someone had created an online fundraising campaign for legal fees. The amount pledged was already in the thousands, with comments pouring in from across the country. Other communities were sharing similar stories, offering support, asking for advice. As midnight approached and the impromptu meeting finally broke up, Maria stood in her darkened cafe. The street outside was quiet now, but she could feel something building, a sense of purpose, of righteous anger, of community power. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but she wouldn't face them alone. She thought about Thomas Webb's smug certainty that they would quietly accept defeat. About all the other Thomas Webbs in all the other banks who saw communities like hers as easy targets. About the courage it had taken to stand up to him that morning, and the strength she had found in the solidarity of her neighbors. Before locking up, Maria walked to the window and removed the open sign. In its place, she hung a new one that read, "Community Strong. We fight back." It was more than a slogan. It was a declaration of war. The first rays of dawn would find Café Luna opening its doors again, serving not just coffee and conscience, but hope and determination. The bank had thought they would win easily. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook's public library cast a harsh glow over the scattered papers covering 3 pushed-together tables. Rachel Torres, a former bank auditor turned community advocate, squinted at yet another loan document through reading glasses that kept sliding down her nose. Around her, a dozen business owners from the neighborhood hunched over their own stacks of paperwork, highlighting patterns that grew more disturbing with each passing hour. "Look at this," Rachel said, pushing a document toward Maria Delgado. "The interest rate adjustment formula they used in your contract? It's different from the one in Elena's, even though you both signed up during the same week." She pulled out another sheet. "And here's James's contract. 3 different formulas, all designed to maximize the bank's profit while keeping the initial payments deceptively low." Maria felt her blood pressure rise as she compared the documents. The numbers danced before her eyes, but even she could see the deliberate complexity, the carefully crafted confusion. "They knew exactly what they were doing," she whispered. The investigation had started small, just a few business owners comparing notes in Café Luna after hours. But as word spread through social media and local news coverage, more victims came forward. The pattern was clear. First Regional Bank had systematically targeted immigrant and minority-owned businesses across 3 different neighborhoods, offering refinancing deals that were nothing short of financial quicksand. The library door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and a familiar face. Marcus Chen, a junior loan officer from First Regional, looked nervously over his shoulder before approaching their table. He carried a thick manila envelope. "I saw the news," he said quietly, placing the envelope on the table. "What they're doing, it's not right. I've been collecting evidence for months, but I didn't know who to trust." His hands shook as he spread out internal memos, email printouts, and training documents. They called it Operation Harvest. They specifically chose neighborhoods with high concentrations of immigrant-owned businesses. The documents revealed a calculated strategy. The bank had profiled businesses based on factors like the owner's English proficiency, immigration status, and likelihood of having access to legal resources. They had even created a scoring system to identify the most vulnerable targets. Rachel's face grew darker as she read. This goes way beyond predatory lending. This is systematic discrimination. Look at these quotas they set for each branch. They were incentivizing their employees to push these toxic loans. Maria thought about Thomas Webb's practiced smile, his reassuring words. How many others like him were out there, seeing people like her not as hardworking business owners but as targets to be exploited? The investigation expanded beyond the library. Community members with various skills joined the effort. College students helped create a database of affected businesses. Tech-savvy volunteers built a secure website where victims could upload their documents and share their stories. Local journalists began digging into First Regional's history, uncovering similar patterns in other cities. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Late one evening, as Maria was closing the cafe, an elderly woman walked in. She introduced herself as Margaret Wheeler, a retired First Regional employee who had worked there for 30 years. "I've been watching what's happening," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "I retired 6 months before they launched Operation Harvest, but I still have friends inside. What they're doing now, it's not the bank I gave my life to." She opened her purse and pulled out a small USB drive. This contains 10 years of internal audit reports. They show exactly when and how the bank's practices changed after the new management took over. The USB drive was a goldmine. It revealed that Operation Harvest wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a larger strategy of predatory lending that had been slowly taking shape for years. The bank had tested various approaches in different markets, refining their tactics until they had developed a system that could efficiently strip equity from vulnerable communities while maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. As word of the investigation spread, unexpected allies emerged. Former bank employees, troubled by their consciences, began reaching out. Community organizations from other cities shared similar stories and strategies. Legal aid organizations offered support. Even some current First Regional employees, disgusted by what they had been asked to do, began anonymously feeding information to the investigation team. The evidence mounted in digital files and bankers' boxes, in sworn statements and secret recordings. Each new piece revealed a deeper layer of corruption, The bank thought they held all the power, but knowledge was its own kind of power. And now, thanks to the dedication of dozens of community members and the courage of whistleblowers like Marcus and Margaret, they had knowledge in abundance. Rachel gathered everyone's attention by tapping a pen against her water glass. "Tomorrow," she announced, "we take everything we've found to the State Banking Commission. But tonight, I want you all to remember something. What we've uncovered here isn't just about one bank or one community. This is about standing up to a system that thinks some people's dreams matter less than others. Whatever happens next, we've already won because we've shown them they were wrong about us." As the meeting broke up, Maria gathered her share of the documents. The weight of the papers in her bag reminded her of all the people counting on them to succeed. Outside, the street lights cast long shadows, but she wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. The truth was finally coming to light, and no amount of banking jargon or legal complexity could hide it much longer. First Regional had thought they were harvesting a community's wealth. Instead, they had planted the seeds of their own downfall. The basement of St. Michael's Church buzzed with whispered conversations in a dozen different languages. Every folding chair was occupied, with people standing 3 deep along the walls. The air conditioning struggled against the combined body heat of over 200 people, business owners, community members, and activists from across the city. At the front of the room, Maria Delgado stood beside a projector screen, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "They thought we would be easy targets," she said, clicking to the next slide, a map showing the bank's systematic targeting of minority neighborhoods. "They thought our differences would keep us divided. But they didn't understand something fundamental about our communities. We know how to survive. We know how to fight. And most importantly, we know how to stand together." The evidence they'd gathered over the past weeks was devastating. Internal bank memos, training materials, and testimony from whistleblowers painted a picture of deliberate exploitation. But what happened next would determine whether justice would be served or if First Regional would simply weather another scandal. The resistance had started small, a social media campaign, a few protests outside bank branches. But it had grown into something the bank's executives hadn't anticipated. Local tech workers had developed an app that helped affected business owners document their cases and connect with legal resources. Artists had created powerful murals depicting the community's struggle, turning blank walls into symbols of resistance. Even local faith leaders had joined the fight, condemning the bank's practices from their pulpits. But tonight, Maria continued, "We launched the next phase." She nodded to Rachel Torres, who distributed detailed action packets to everyone present. "Operation Boomerang begins tomorrow at 9 a.m. The plan was audacious. They would coordinate mass withdrawals from First Regional accounts across the city, not just by affected business owners but by their supporters as well. Community organizations had arranged for mobile banking units from ethical credit unions to park outside First Regional branches, ready to help people transfer their accounts. Social media influencers were primed to live stream the events. Local news stations had been tipped off. Meanwhile, their legal team would file a class action lawsuit, accompanied by a comprehensive dossier of evidence that would be simultaneously sent to state and federal banking regulators, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and every major news outlet in the country. As Maria outlined the strategy, she noticed Thomas Webb skulking at the back of the room, apparently thinking himself cleverly disguised in casual clothes instead of his usual suit. She smiled inwardly. They had been expecting bank spies. In fact, they were counting on them. "Some of you may be wondering about retaliation," Maria acknowledged, addressing the fear she saw in some faces. "That's why we've partnered with ethical financial institutions who have pledged emergency bridge loans to any business targeted by the bank. We protect our own." The meeting shifted to logistics. Different groups huddled around tables, reviewing their roles. Restaurant owners coordinated food supplies for the protesters who would maintain a continuous presence outside bank branches. Tech-savvy volunteers did final checks on the encrypted communication system they'd set up. Legal observers received their assignments. What the bank wouldn't know until too late was that Operation Boomerang was just the visible part of their strategy. Behind the scenes, a team of forensic accountants, including former bank employees, had been tracking First Regional's international transactions, uncovering evidence of money laundering and tax evasion. This evidence was already in sealed envelopes, ready to be delivered to federal investigators if the bank tried to play hardball. As midnight approached, Maria noticed Elena from the grocery store comforting a younger business owner who was crying softly. The young woman had received a threatening letter from the bank that morning, suggesting that her immigration status might need to be reviewed if she joined any actions against the bank. Maria's blood boiled. She walked over and took the young woman's hands in hers. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "That letter isn't legal enforcement, it's desperation. They're trying to scare you because they're scared of us. Together, we are more powerful than they could ever imagine." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Maria stood outside Café Luna, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates. Teams were in position. Legal observers were stationed. Media crews were setting up. The encrypted messaging system was active. At precisely 9 a.m., Maria looked up at the bank's cameras and smiled as she taped a notice to her café window: "Closed today." Banking at First Regional? So were we. Join us in saying enough. Similar signs appeared simultaneously in hundreds of business windows across the city. The first wave of account holders arrived at bank branches right as they opened, each withdrawing their maximum daily limit. As lines formed, food trucks appeared, offering free coffee and snacks to those waiting. Musicians set up impromptu performances. What could have been a tense situation became a celebration of community solidarity. By noon, 3 branches had run out of cash. By 2, the bank's PR team was in full crisis mode as videos of empty cash drawers and closed branch doors went viral. Local news crews captured everything, broadcasting live as people shared their stories of the bank's predatory practices. The lawsuit filing hit the news cycle just as the markets closed. First Regional's stock took an immediate hit in after-hours trading. But the real damage was to their reputation. Every major news outlet was running stories about the bank's systematic exploitation of immigrant communities. Hashtags like #BoomerangJustice and #BankRunForJustice trended nationally. That evening, as Maria finally sat down in her quiet cafe, her phone rang. It was Rachel. "They're calling an emergency board meeting," she said excitedly. "Our sources say several board members are demanding Webb's resignation. But here's the best part, remember those sealed envelopes? Turns out we weren't the only ones investigating the bank. The FBI just announced a separate probe into their international dealings." Maria thought about Thomas Webb's smug smile, about all the lives his bank had tried to destroy. She thought about the young woman from the meeting, terrified by the bank's threats but still brave enough to stand with her community. She thought about her father, who had taught her that true wealth wasn't about money, it was about the strength of the bonds between people. The resistance wasn't just about saving their businesses anymore. It had become something larger, a statement about the power of unity, about refusing to be victims, about turning fear into strength. First Regional had tried to harvest their community's wealth, but instead, they had harvested something far more valuable: its power. As night fell over the city, lights blazed in First Regional's executive offices. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Maria knew with absolute certainty that they had already won the most important battle. They had shown that when people stand together, even the most powerful institutions can be forced to face justice. The bank had thought they were just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were about to learn that they were something far more formidable. They were a community awakened to its own power. The conference room on the 38th floor of First Regional's headquarters felt like a pressure cooker. Maria Delgado sat at one end of the polished mahogany table, flanked by Rachel Torres and their legal team. Across from them, Thomas Webb's face had lost its usual smugness, replaced by a barely concealed panic. Between them sat Catherine Armstrong, First Regional's newly appointed CEO, her silver hair and steel-gray suit radiating authority. The resistance had brought the bank to its knees faster than anyone had expected. 3 weeks of coordinated account withdrawals had drained over $2 billion from First Regional's coffers. Their stock had plummeted 40%. Major institutional clients were jumping ship. But what had finally forced this meeting wasn't the financial bleeding, it was the revelation that had exploded across social media the previous night. Marcus Chen, the whistleblower who had first provided evidence of Operation Harvest, had been found dead in his apartment. The police called it suicide. The community knew better. Hours before his death, he had sent Maria an encrypted file containing recordings of conversations that went far beyond predatory lending. They revealed a complex web of international money laundering, tax evasion, and connections to organized crime that reached the highest levels of the bank's leadership. Ms. Delgado, Catherine Armstrong began, her voice cutting through the tension, "I've spent the past 48 hours reviewing everything, the predatory loans, the targeted exploitation, and now these latest allegations. I was brought in by the board to clean house, but I'm finding the rot goes deeper than anyone suspected." Maria studied the woman carefully. Catherine Armstrong had a reputation as a corporate turnaround specialist, but also as someone who had consistently championed ethical banking practices. Her appointment 3 days ago had sent shockwaves through the financial industry. "With all due respect, Ms. Armstrong," Maria replied, "we're past the point where apologies and promises of reform will suffice. Marcus Chen died trying to expose the truth. We have evidence that bank officials knew about death threats against him and did nothing." Armstrong's face hardened. "I know. I've already turned that evidence over to the FBI. Thomas Webb and several other executives were arrested an hour ago." She turned to Webb, who had half risen from his chair. "I wouldn't leave if I were you, Thomas. The federal agents outside would love an excuse to add resisting arrest to your charges." Webb slumped back into his chair, his face ashen. But Maria wasn't celebrating yet. She had learned the hard way not to trust bankers' promises, no matter how well-intentioned they seemed. "What exactly are you proposing?" Rachel asked, her auditor's instincts kicking in. Armstrong opened a thick folder. "Complete debt forgiveness for all victims of Operation Harvest. A $3 billion community development fund, administered by an independent board that your organization helped select. Full cooperation with federal investigators, even if it means exposing our own board members. And most importantly, a complete restructuring of our lending practices, with oversight from community representatives." The numbers were staggering, but Maria's mind was on Marcus Chen's empty apartment, on the young business owners who had nearly lost everything, on the community that had fought back against seemingly impossible odds. "Not enough," Maria said quietly. The room fell silent. "We want First Regional to become a public benefit corporation, with community members holding controlling interest on the board. The predatory banking system doesn't just need reform, it needs transformation." Armstrong's eyebrows shot up. Several bank executives started to protest, but she silenced them with a raised hand. "Do you have a specific proposal?" Rachel pulled out a document they had prepared for exactly this moment. It outlined a revolutionary banking model, one that would transform First Regional from a predatory institution into a community-owned financial cooperative. As Armstrong read, her expression changed from skepticism to intrigue. "This is, actually brilliant," she said finally. "It would require shareholder approval, but given the alternative of prolonged federal investigations and potential criminal charges." She looked at the nervous executives around the table. "I assume I have the board's proxy to negotiate terms?" The next 4 hours were intense. Terms were debated, lawyers consulted, documents drafted and redrafted. Outside, the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Maria thought about how this had all started, with a single threatening letter that was meant to intimidate her into silence. The bank had never imagined that letter would lead to its own transformation. Just before midnight, Catherine Armstrong signed the final document. "Congratulations," she said, extending her hand to Maria. "You've just made banking history." But Maria wasn't done. She pulled out one last document, a draft press release detailing Marcus Chen's findings about the bank's international criminal connections. "Sign the agreement, and this stays sealed," she said. "Try to back out of any part of our deal, and it goes public." "We're trusting you, Ms. Armstrong, but trust requires accountability." Armstrong took the envelope, opened it, and read its contents. Her face paled slightly, but there was respect in her eyes when she looked up. "You really did think of everything, didn't you?" "We had to," Maria replied simply. "Too many lives depend on getting this right." As they left the building, Maria's phone buzzed with messages from community members waiting for news. She thought about how to tell them that their resistance had accomplished something unprecedented. They hadn't just won concessions from the bank, they had taken ownership of it. The lobby was empty except for the night security guard, but Maria paused by the grand marble columns. Soon, this space would be redesigned to be more welcoming, more accessible to the community it was meant to serve. The bank's predatory past would be transformed into a future of ethical, community-centered banking. Outside, Rachel was already coordinating with their team about next steps, setting up the transition committee, planning community outreach, designing new financial education programs. The real work was just beginning, but they had proven something powerful. When communities unite and refuse to back down, even the most entrenched systems can be changed. As they walked to their cars, Maria's phone rang one last time. It was Catherine Armstrong. "I forgot to ask," she said, "would you consider joining our new board? We need people who aren't afraid to speak truth to power." Maria looked up at the bank's towering headquarters, its windows gleaming in the night sky. Yesterday, it had been a symbol of exploitation. Tomorrow, it would become a beacon of hope for communities everywhere fighting for financial justice. "Yes," she said. "But I have some ideas about where we need to start." 6 months after the historic takeover of First Regional Bank, Maria Delgado stood in the transformed main branch lobby, hardly recognizing the space. Gone were the imposing marble counters and bulletproof glass. Instead, comfortable seating areas and open consultation pods created an welcoming atmosphere. Digital screens displayed information in 12 different languages, and community artwork adorned the walls. But the real transformation went far deeper than aesthetics. As she prepared for the first annual meeting of the new community-owned bank, now renamed Community First Financial, Maria reviewed the numbers on her tablet. The statistics told a story that even the most optimistic supporters hadn't dared to hope for. Foreclosure rates in minority neighborhoods had dropped by 87%. Small business loan approvals had increased by 65%, with default rates actually lower than under the old predatory system. The bank's new microlending program had helped launch over 200 new local businesses. Most surprisingly, deposits had grown as people who had never trusted banks before started bringing their savings into an institution they could finally call their own. But success had brought its own challenges. Traditional banks, fearful that the community-first model would spread, had launched a coordinated campaign to undermine them. Regulatory challenges appeared out of nowhere. Mysterious, concerned citizens groups, funded by Wall Street interests, ran attack ads questioning the bank's stability. The opposition had reached its peak 3 months ago when a coordinated disinformation campaign nearly triggered a run on the bank. Maria remembered standing in the same lobby, watching as worried customers lined up to withdraw their savings. But then something remarkable happened. Community leaders from every neighborhood showed up spontaneously to speak with people in line. Shop owners brought coffee and food. Customers who had benefited from the bank's new policies shared their stories. By day's end, not only had the panic subsided, but deposits had actually increased as people moved their money from other banks in a show of solidarity. The attempted attack had backfired, strengthening the very institution it had meant to destroy. Today's annual meeting would mark another milestone. Representatives from 12 other cities were flying in to learn about replicating the community-first model in their own communities. What had started as a local resistance against one predatory bank was becoming a nationwide movement for financial justice. Maria's reflections were interrupted by the arrival of Catherine Armstrong, who had surprised everyone by staying on as CEO after the transition. "Ready for the big announcement?" Catherine asked, her eyes twinkling with excitement. The big announcement had been months in the making. Community First was about to launch the most ambitious financial inclusion program in American banking history. Using blockchain technology and artificial intelligence, they had developed a new credit scoring system that considered factors traditional banks ignored: rent payment history, business cash flow patterns, community relationships, and more. The pilot program results are even better than we hoped, Catherine continued, showing Maria the latest data. We've been able to extend credit to people who would never qualify under traditional systems, and our repayment rates are outstanding. It turns out that when you treat people with respect and give them a fair chance, they prove themselves worthy of trust. The main conference room was packed well beyond capacity. Community members sat shoulder to shoulder with banking executives and regulatory officials. Local business owners who had once faced foreclosure now sat on advisory boards. The young woman who had received threatening letters about her immigration status was now heading the bank's multilingual outreach program. As Maria took the podium to open the meeting, she spotted a familiar face in the back: Thomas Webb, who had been released on bail pending his trial. He had come disguised again, probably hoping to gather intelligence for his former Wall Street allies. Maria smiled, remembering how they had once feared his power. Now he was just another reminder of how far they had come. 1 year ago, Maria began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, we stood up against a system that saw our communities as resources to be exploited. Today, we're showing the world what banking can look like when it serves the people instead of preying on them. She outlined the year's achievements: the thousands of homes saved from foreclosure, the businesses supported, the lives transformed. But it was when she announced the new credit scoring system that the room erupted in applause. People understood that this wasn't just a new banking product, it was a direct challenge to one of the fundamental tools of financial discrimination. After the formal presentations, Maria wandered through the crowd, listening to conversations in a dozen languages. A group of elderly Vietnamese women were excitedly discussing the bank's new elder care financial planning services. Young entrepreneurs huddled around tablets, exploring the microlending platform. Community organizers from other cities traded notes on starting their own banking revolutions. In a quiet moment, Maria found herself standing next to Rachel Torres, who had become the bank's chief compliance officer. They watched as Catherine Armstrong demonstrated the new credit scoring system to a group of federal regulators. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Rachel asked softly. "When you got that first foreclosure notice?" Maria thought about the journey, from the fear and anger of those early days to the triumph of taking control of their financial destiny. She thought about Marcus Chen, whose sacrifice had helped expose the truth. She thought about all the people who had stood together, refusing to be victims. "Maybe not here exactly," Maria replied, "but I always knew we'd win. Because we weren't just fighting for our businesses or our homes. We were fighting for our dignity, our community, our future." As the meeting wound down, Maria received a message that made her smile. The federal investigation into First Regional's former practices had expanded to 3 other major banks. The evidence Marcus Chen had gathered was creating a domino effect through the financial industry. Outside, the sun was setting on another busy day in the neighborhood. Through the bank's new glass walls, Maria could see people going about their lives, shop owners closing up, families heading home, students studying in the bank's free community space. The bank's lights would stay on late into the evening for financial literacy classes and community meetings. What had started as resistance had become revolution, and the revolution was still spreading. Community First wasn't just a bank anymore, it was proof that when people dared to imagine a different kind of financial system, they could make it reality. 5 years had passed since the community takeover of First Regional Bank, and Maria Delgado stood at the podium of the National Banking Reform Conference in Washington, D.C. The audience before her included senators, federal regulators, international finance experts, and community leaders from across the globe. On the screen behind her, a map showed hundreds of points of light, each representing a community bank that had adopted what was now known as the Millbrook model. "When we first challenged First Regional Bank," Maria began, her voice carrying through the hushed auditorium, "people called us dreamers. They said community ownership of banks was impossible. They said ethical banking couldn't be profitable. They said we would fail within a year." She paused, allowing a slight smile. "Today, Community First Financial has the highest customer satisfaction ratings and lowest default rates in the industry. More importantly, we've proven that banking can be both profitable and just." The statistics were undeniable. The Millbrook model had spread to over 300 banks nationwide. Communities that had once been banking deserts now had thriving financial institutions owned by and accountable to their residents. The predatory lending practices that had once devastated minority neighborhoods had been replaced by sustainable, community-centered banking. But the transformation hadn't stopped at banking. The movement had sparked a broader revolution in community economics. Maria clicked to the next slide, showing the ripple effects of their victory. In Millbrook itself, the changes were profound. The neighborhood where Café Luna stood had become a case study in community-driven development. Small businesses flourished, supported by fair lending practices and innovative financial products. The Community Development Fund, seeded by the settlement with First Regional, had funded everything from affordable housing to technology training programs. The young woman who had once received threatening letters about her immigration status was now a state senator, championing legislation to protect vulnerable communities from financial exploitation. Elena's grocery store had expanded into a successful chain of community markets. James Park's dry cleaning business had evolved into a worker-owned cooperative that provided living wages and profit sharing for its employees. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in the way other communities viewed their own power. The Millbrook resistance had created a template for challenging systemic financial injustice. Every month, delegations from other cities and countries visited Community First to learn how they could replicate its success. The key, Maria explained to the conference audience, was understanding that real change requires more than just replacing bad actors with good ones. We had to transform the entire system of financial power. When communities own their financial institutions, they control their economic destiny. She thought about Thomas Webb, now serving a 15-year federal sentence for his role in the bank's criminal activities. His trial had exposed connections between predatory banking practices and organized crime that had led to reforms across the financial industry. The evidence Marcus Chin had died protecting had helped bring down not just Webb, but an entire network of corrupt bankers and officials. Catherine Armstrong, who had become a leading advocate for ethical banking, joined Maria at the podium. 5 years ago, she said, I thought I was being brought in to save a bank. Instead, I became part of a movement that's saving communities. The Millbrook model isn't just about banking. It's about restoring power to people who had been systematically excluded from the financial system. The conference screens showed live feeds from Community First branches across the country. In each location, people were gathering for the bank's annual Community Ownership Day. Children played in kid-friendly spaces while their parents attended financial literacy workshops. Senior citizens received one-on-one assistance with retirement planning. Small business owners collaborated in co-working spaces. But it was the next announcement that caused a stir in the audience. Community First was launching a national initiative to buy and convert predatory payday lending operations into community-owned financial centers. The program would use the same strategies that had succeeded against First Regional, combining community organizing, legal action, and innovative financing to transform exploitative institutions into community assets. This is what victory looks like, Maria declared, gesturing to the screens. Not just defeating injustice, but building something better in its place. Every community has the power to do what we did in Millbrook. They just need to believe in themselves and each other. After the conference, Maria walked through the National Mall, remembering the day 5 years ago when she had received that first threatening letter from First Regional. She could never have imagined then that standing up to one predatory bank would spark a national movement for financial justice. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel Torres, who was now running Community First's national expansion program. Another major bank was facing community pressure to adopt the Millbrook model. Its board had requested a meeting. Maria smiled, thinking about how far they had come. The bank that had tried to destroy their community had instead become the catalyst for its transformation. What had started as resistance had become revolution, and the revolution was still spreading. That evening, she returned to Café Luna, now a historic landmark recognized as the birthplace of the community banking movement. The café walls displayed photographs documenting their journey, the protests, the victories, the transformations. But Maria's favorite was a simple sign, preserved from those early days of resistance: community strong. We fight back. As she looked around at the busy café, where business owners still gathered to share ideas and support each other, she realized that their greatest victory wasn't in the numbers or statistics. It was in the knowledge that they had changed what people believed was possible. The bank had thought they were harvesting a community's wealth. Instead, they had awakened its power. And that power was still growing, spreading from community to community, transforming the very foundations of finance in America. The revolution that began in Millbrook hadn't ended, it had only begun.